It's the most smallest and the fewest words packed into a book in the Bible. 2 John is by far the smallest book. I think 3 John follows with a few more words, but 2 John packs a unique punch in my heart. I don't know if I've ever shared this, but when I was working as a camp counselor in Island Lake Camp, Plousville, Washington, back in the summer, I believe, of 2006, I had an opportunity to hear an individual who quoted from memory the whole book of Ephesians. And I said, that's pretty impressive. I bet I can do that too. But I said, I'm not quite as ambitious as him, though, so I'm going to start with the 2 John. So I proceeded to memorize the book of 2 John that summer and was able to do that. And after a few weeks of doing that, I actually moved on to other books as well. But 2 John is unique in that I believe John talks about a lot of things in a very few short purposes. As we've already looked, we have seen the foundation of Christian character comes from God. We've seen that the principles of Christian character are truth, love, and obedience. We saw last week's the limits of this character, the limits of what we can and cannot do. As within the boundaries of love, what are those limits? And then today we'll be looking at the last point that I think he makes, is the found blessing of Christian fellowship is complete joy. Which leads me to a simple question. How do we have a Christian relationship with other believers? And I ask that question because I don't know about you, but it seems to me that in our culture, in our society, we don't know our neighbors. We just don't know our neighbors. I have lived in my house, for about 7 years now. Just this past year, within the last year, I started talking to the neighbor directly across the street who's been there an equal amount of time. 6 years of just waving and being cordial and not really doing anything. It's interesting. That's the nature of our society today, right? We are far more of a moving culture here, particularly in the United States, I think. You have a vehicle, you can drive to your friend's house 30 blocks away. You have a vehicle, you can meet at X, Y, and Z. You can go places, do things at central points because everybody drives there. They can go there. We have things called social media that we can actually engage in without actually being present. So in our modern times, this question really is, how, in light of all these challenges do we have a Christian relationship with other believers? What's the foundation for it? How do we do it? What's the point of that? And I think it's very intentional to ask. As we look at our chart of 2 John, we see this will be the conclusion and the last portion of it, dealing with chapters 12 and 13, which I'll read right here. Again, my translation, rough as it is, it reads, 2 John, first starting with verse 12. It says, though I have much to write to you, I do not have a desire to do so with paper and ink. But I expect to come to you and speak to your face in order that our joy will be filled. Greetings to you from the children of your chosen sister. Basically, a couple of sentences there that detail 2 points I think John's trying to make. And the basic principle is Christian joy is not based solely on theology. It's more than that. It's also dealt with Christian fellowship. Oftentimes, I think we're really big on our theological perspectives. We're really big on our foundational principles of our faith, right? And we tell people this, right? When a person is sad, what do we tell them to do? Pray. We tell them, think that God's in control. We tell them, for the better or worse, you're doing fine. Don't worry about it. Okay, those are Christianese answers. And yes, they're very true. God is in control. And yes, you are stable. God is watching over you. Nothing's going to happen without His approval. But in the midst of all your turmoil, sometimes you need people like Job's friends. You remember that story? Job was a guy who lost everything. He lost his kids, he lost his fortune. The only thing he had left was a nagging wife. What happened? Job's friends come. And yes, they do criticize him, but we miss that one statement where they say they sat in silence with him for almost a week. They came and mourned and grieved with him. That's what a relationship is. Oftentimes, we get so lost in our theological precepts that we forget things. I think the Apostle Paul says this very well in 1 Corinthians 13, when he says, "If I speak in the tongues of men and angels but do not have love, I become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." In other words, we are missing the value. When we have just our theology, but not the underlying principle of love for another or fellowship with one another, we miss the whole point of our theology. Just the nature of the beast. So we can't have one and not the other. Christian joy is more than theology. But we need to start by saying it is vital that Christians have a good understanding of a theological concepts. It's a good understanding that we have the knowledge of the Bible. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a really bad idea to go out there and ignore scripture, principles, or even doctrinal beliefs. Okay? You cannot go through life without some sort of rudder on your ship. Something that points your compass in the right direction. We need that. Every one of us need that. But our joy, our innermost being, and the satisfaction and the ability to be comforted and the ability to be accepted, and what we would call our happiness, is not complete with just theology. Theology is important. But here's the reality. No amount of theology is going to make you jump for joy. You can know all the terms in all the books. You can read everything you want to read about whatever topic. But it's likely not going to fill that hole in your heart that desires companionship, that desires a friend, that desires someone to come along with you. Yes, God fills that hole. He can. But I think it is more full when you have someone to go through life together. There's a verse kind of taken out of context in the book of Amos, Amos 3:3. It says, "Do two walk together unless they have chosen to do so?" You know, life is about relationships. It's about friendships. It's about interacting with other people. No man is an island. Joy comes. So what we say is joy, complete joy. I mean, Apostle Paul will write in Galatians that joy, first of all, is a fruit of the Spirit. We all know that, given by God, right? Fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, so on and so forth. It's a gift from the Almighty. Secondly, we find it is to be considered, something that is to be examined, as some translations will say. It is like James 1. It says, "Consider it pure joy, brothers, when you face trials of all kind." Okay, that means to stop and look at it. It's kind of like taking an onion apart. Anyone ever done that without crying? Literally, onions are the worst. You start and you got to peel that outer paper off, right? And then usually you take your knife and you make a small cut and you just kind of take that last layer and then you go about your business. Have you ever done layer by layer by layer by layer by layer by layer? There's just another layer underneath there. That's examining an onion, by the way. That's looking at an onion and taking it apart. One piece, another, till you get down to the very little. Nothing left. That's what examining means. So our joy is to be examined. It is something we are to sit there and go, why am I feeling so okay in this situation? When my car blew up, why was I sitting there just kind of, okay, whatever? When, those kind of circumstances happen, why are we able to run with them in a different way than other people. Have you noticed? It's because of that joy that we have. It's considered. It's something that we have inside of us. And it is something to be exercised in the midst of all trials. A very fascinating statement there, because the word exercised requires work, effort, time. In other words, joy isn't going to be natural necessarily. My big muscles didn't come to me overnight, okay? I had to work on them at work. You know, I'm too poor to go to a gym, so I get a job instead. Okay? That is what we do. We exercise. We work this joy out. It's kind of a requirement, because guess what? You're going to hit all kinds of things that are cause you all kinds of problems. I mean, anything and everything, from the fact you forget your backpack, leave it in the pew on the way out of here today, or, you know, worst case scenario, you have a flat tire somewhere, or they shut Interstate 84 down on your way to work. I mean, there's nothing worse than that. It was a bad drive on Friday, by the way. But we have to be able to exercise that. That means we have to work at it. In other words, it's not going to come naturally. So it's a given by God. It is something that we should look at, and it is something also that we should work on. That's what Christian joy is. But is that all joy is? Or is there something missing? Is there a piece to this picture that may not be complete? And I will tell you, Smith, that John actually talks about that. He says that Christian joy is completed with Christian fellowship. In verse 13, he basically says a number of things, but we're going to go through that. And he says the first one is, Christian joy is most complete with fellow Christians. This makes sense, logically, right? Because we all have the same God, we're all worshiping the same person, and we're all doing, hopefully, His will. And when you're all going in the same direction, and everyone is doing what they think they should be doing according to God, the cars drive smoothly. It's like on an Interstate 84 when it's not closed, okay? Everything goes smoothly. No one's coming back at you. No one's going to the right. No one's going to the left. They're all going straight, following the laws. It works well. Christian joy is the same way. When we are with fellow Christians of like mind, things go well. We see that. The second point's a little different and a little interesting. It says it requires face-to-face meetings. Now, take a look at what he says. He says, I hope to visit you and talk with you face-to-face. Other translations are, instead of the word the hope, it's the expectation. He expects to come and visit. In other words, it's going to happen. It's just, Lord willing. John anticipates his joy being full, being complete. The idea there being the cup was running over, according to like the psalmist, right? It requires the face-to-face meetings. You know what is sad? That when COVID hit, we stopped meeting. I don't know about you, but there's a lot of people that just said, hey, we don't have to go to church. This is great. And there's an equal number that said, yeah, man, I can't go to church today. It just felt wrong. It felt bad. It felt something was missing. That was your Christian joy telling you it's not complete. Something is missing. Those that were off celebrating, well, we'll let them celebrate. But when your joy is not complete, you notice it. And that is where we're at. Christian joy requires a face-to-face meeting. And secondly, Christian fellowship is both a global and local idea. Oftentimes, we tend to focus on our brethren and sisters in our own local communities and local churches. And we ignore, perhaps, the churches at large. The church down the street. The church the next town over. The church halfway across the world. We ignore them because they don't matter, right? Because we don't interact with them. But according to John, when he says this. He says, the children of your chosen sister send their greetings. Odds are John was not writing from the same town where the church that he's written to is. Odds are he's not. He could be in Rome, and this was in Ephesus. You got to think, they're large towns separated by many miles. And yet, he is saying the fellowship that we have with one another, that church over there is sending their greetings to you. That is interesting. Very, very interesting. That it's a global and local entity. We as a church used to have that sunrise service on Easter up at the Trop Creek Bible Camp. That was a local Greek gathering of multiple, 2 or 3 other churches. It was a fun time. It was a good time. We all got together. It was exciting. We need to do more of that. But at the same time, we also need to be embracing churches that are halfway across the world. Those that are not present with us right now. We need to have an outlook that looks beyond just our local entity of our solid 15 that attend here. And instead, we need to look at the global church. How can we reach out? How can we have that fellowship with multiple other people? Question we can have. Our Christian joy is completed with our fellowship with other Christians. We see that. So how do we have a Christian fellowship or relationship with other believers? There's the question I asked at the start. And the answer, I think, is very simple. It's by meeting in person as often as possible with both local and global Christians. When I say that, there's a couple things we want to talk about. The first one is, it takes effort. We have to be willing to actually go and meet other people. I got to walk across my street and meet my neighbor sometime. I need to go find that church that's down the street from me. I need to talk to them. They are members of the church. We serve the same God. It takes effort. It is something we have to do. Secondly, in this idea, it means we cannot have preferences for anything. I.e., the Baptists and the Lutherans, right? You can't have these invisible walls built up that prohibit a relationship with one another simply over a few doctrinal issues that don't keep you out of heaven.
Amen.
I mean, whether or not we think the King James is the only Bible, or whether you think it's one of many, or whether you think you can drink beer, or whether you can't drink beer, or whether it's okay to wear a tie, or where it's not okay to wear a tie. I mean, all these superficial issues are not heaven issues, folks. Maybe you don't attend a Lutheran church because you're a Baptist and you don't believe that necessarily, but you still have relationship with the Lutherans. There's no room for these ridiculous walls that we set up. No room. When we meet in person as often as possible, we're not looking at this saying they have to conform to my checklist of all these ideas, otherwise I'm out of here. We're not going to play with them. It's also regional. We can say that. There are some people that don't like people from perhaps the other side of the railroad tracks. There's an economic, perhaps, factor going in there. A wealthy, well-to-do church may not want to have to do with a small, struggling church. A church or a ministry that serves the homeless may not be comfortable going to a church that doesn't. It's crazy. But the prejudice goes both ways. It really do. There's no room for that in God's church. There's no room for us to have our complete joy. We're not going to have it if we have these ridiculous boundaries. So it's something we have to do intentional. We cannot have our boundaries, our invisible walls set up. And the last one that I just kind of want to point out here is you got to be willing to accept differences. Because I guarantee you, A person from China who is meeting in a born-again Christian is going to have different experiences than a person from Alabama, who's going to have a radically different perspective than an individual from Springdale, Oregon. We all come to the table with different backgrounds, culturally, economically, personally, theologically. We have to be willing to accept them. Not only can we not have these boundaries and checklists, but we have to go beyond that and reach out to other people and be willing to accept them. Like we said last week, the only issues you don't accept them with is when it becomes a doctrinal statement that says Jesus is not God. In multiple ways to heaven. Any issue that says Christ is not king. Those are the pinnacles and the hills you die on. Whether or not you wear a tie to church or not is pointless. Accept the differences. That's how you have a relationship with other believers. The Apostle Paul writes in Colossians 4, as we conclude, he says, "Conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you," again, he's hopeful there that he will, "or remain absent, I'll hear you are standing firm in one spirit, unified in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel." It's crazy to think about, but our reputation as a church, what others see and other people talk about, oftentimes starts with the fellowship that we have when we are together. Oftentimes, our reputation as a church starts with the times that we spend together. A Christian, the joy that we have, the blessing of that fellowship, is complete joy. Let's close with a word of prayer.